Friends, a few years ago I was in back of the main altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York one morning, making my Thanksgiving after Mass. Some gentleman came up to me and he said, Father, he said, I commute every morning into New York City from Westchester, and I go to communion every morning. Naturally, I come in fasting. But he said, this morning my conscience is a bit troubled. There is someone on the radio whom I positively cannot stand. He drives me crazy. And that's Monsignor Sheen. So he said this morning on the train I was talking to a few gentlemen, and I spoke very severely and critically about him. Now, if you think that that is serious, will you please hear my confession? Otherwise, we'll just skip it. Well, I said, no, there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, I said, I share your opinion. And there are moments when I condemn him 1,000 times more than you do. And I commended him for his piety of coming in every morning, communion. We talked together for about 10 minutes. As he left, he patted me on the shoulder and he said, My, it sure is wonderful to meet a nice priest like you. I did not tell him who I was. Maybe he since discovered it. But in any case, we always have to be ready for some kind of humiliation. And that brings up the question as to whether or not we are suffering from an inferiority complex when such things happen. Would you be interested in hearing about inferiority complexes tonight? The inferiority complex was given to the world by a psychologist with the name of Alfred Adler. And it's easy enough to understand. The inferiority complex reduces itself to these principles. Number one, everyone is anxious to achieve superiority and has a drive towards superiority. Two, he does not always achieve it. When he does not achieve it, he sometimes will compensate for it by a substitute behavior in which there is still a drive for superiority. And this indirect way of achieving it is what he calls an inferiority complex. Now, there can be various kinds of inferiority complexes. For example, there can be the physical. Namely, a woman is too fat and she feels very inferior around thin women. I heard of a woman that kind who went to a gymnasium and the instructor said she would have to chin herself 20 times a day, and she said, which chin? And then there is the social inferiority. For example, the little girl who says, Mama, why do I always have to wear overalls? And the other girls can wear overalls for fun. Then there's the economic inferiority of having a Chevrolet in a Buick neighborhood. Or else having been born on the other side of the tracks. Now let me show you how the inferiority complex is supposed to work. I'm going to tell it to you in the form of a parable. It's about a muskrat coat that had an inferiority complex to be a mink. And he showed it, first of all, by having a very expensive silk lining. And the initials were embroidered on the inside of the silk lining. And then this muskrat coat had the sleeves rolled back because it looked more like a mink. That particular way. Always wore a price tag in the back. 7,500 genuine ranch mink. And liked to parade, of course, always on Fifth Avenue in company with other minks. And then when winter came, always went into cold storage with mink coats. Never would go to a cheap storage where there were muskrat coats. But the poor muskrat had his difficulties, of course, despite the fact that he wore mink perfume all the time. He tried to keep up with the minks. He knew that minks were rather hardy and that you could sit on a mink. And so he loved to be sat on, just to prove he was a mink. But he couldn't take it. It told in the end. And he stayed away from all movie houses because he was afraid of sitting next to a muskrat coat and being recognized. So he began to worry more and more with this inferiority that he had, and he went to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist put the muskrat out on a couch and began asking all kinds of Freudian questions, and the psychiatrist said, "You know the trouble with you? Your mother was frightened by a mink." And then the psychiatrist finally told the poor muskrat coat that he would have to be given a shock treatment. And the shock treatment consisted of the muskrat being put into a cabinet with minks. And you know what the minks said one to another? "I smell a rat." Well, they got so angry they pulled all of the hair out of the muskrat. And he never was any better. You know what happened to him? He walked the streets of New York saying he was the only bald mink in New York. Incurable inferiority complex. Now that's what happens to muskrats. Now let's find out what happens to human beings. A human being can play his superiority either direct, or he can play his superiority indirectly. Play it straight or play it crooked. If a one has an undue sense of superiority and plays it straight, becomes the balloon type. Then the indirect are of various kinds. For example, there are the dreamers. There are the worm eaters. They are very interesting, the worm eaters. And then there are a peculiar kind of animal called, now I'm spelling this correctly, the tail-bearing animal. First way of showing superiority is directly, in which one is constantly using the pronoun I, affirming his ego, asserting his own will. Take, for example, Russia. Russia is a beautiful example of a direct love of superiority. Russia knows, for example, that industrially it cannot keep a pace with the United States. That is why Russia covers up its sense of inferiority by saying that they invented everything. Hence, when Vyshinsky, Gromyko, Malik go back, they always bring back radios and admirals and refrigerators and everything else. How else could they invent these things unless they brought them back? Now you take, for example, a man like Vyshinsky at the United Nations. Vyshinsky is an educated man. He is not like some of the younger barbarians that were trained under communism. He belongs to the Tsarist culture. He knows the classics. Vyshinsky knows very well, for example, that there are millions and millions of people enslaved in Russia. So he has a sense of inferiority in relationship to the Western world. That is why whenever he gets up in the United Nations, he always accuses the Western nations, and in particular the United States, of being a slave nation. That's the way he covers up his sense of inferiority. Then the director also those who are very loud, the loud mouths that come into a room, shouting and shrieking. They're the kind that always shake hands with you up to the elbows. Beware of that kind of a man. In other words, here I am. Then they wear loud clothes. I think the fondness today for loud shirts is an evidence of the desire to be seen and heard. It's craving for superiority. Men wear socks today that are so loud their feet never go to sleep. Now the indirect type of superiority, first of all, there are the dreamers. They are unable to achieve superiority in real life. So they live in a world of fantasy in which they believe themselves superior. Take, for example, the boy who gets sick just before examination time. His fantasy is that if he hadn't been sick, he would have passed the examination. And there's also this particular group that has had a particular fascination for me. I've always noticed that many of the libraries in the universities of the United States have been given by men who hardly ever went beyond the 7th or 8th grade. Ever notice that? Why is that? They have a sense of inferiority about culture and education, so they endow a library. See how educated I am? There was one man who made a fortune after he invented dynamite. Made it possible to make wars more terrible than ever before. He constructed these plants to build dynamite throughout the world. He had a sense of inferiority of all the harm, actual and possible, that had been done and could be done. And so he gave us the Nobel Peace Prize. That was Mr. Nobel. Then in addition to that, there are also the worm eaters. The worm eaters cover up their desire for inferiority by minimizing themselves. They're so humble. Nobody loves me. They're always going out in the garden to eat woolly worms. They love to go into the doghouse. And they're proud of being in a doghouse, Mark. And so they say, well, it's all right, pay no attention to me. I'm ready to die. Nobody cares. The communists are worm eaters. The communists love to be put in jail. Then they can say, see, I'm a hero. And then beyond the worm eaters, there are the tail-bearing animals. They are those who have a fine sense of rumor. They give everybody the benefit of the dirt. They're never happy until they can get something on somebody. And then they whisper it around. And thus they make themselves superior to others by pointing out the vices and the inferiority of others. Now, such are ways in which people manifest their superiority. What are we to think of this inferiority complex? As you can readily see, it's not an inferiority complex, it's a superiority complex. That's what it is. It isn't anything new. Adler has become very popular on account of coining the words. But we know it under another name. This is what that sense of inferiority is. It is actually the sin of pride. Pride is an undue estimation, an inordinate esteem of one's own excellence. And what has to be conquered is not inferiority, but superiority. There's much more in Thomas Aquinas on the superiority complex than there is in Adler on the inferiority complex. As a matter of fact, Thomas Aquinas shows 12 distinct forms of the superiority complex. Now, why do people today suffer from what Adler calls an inferiority complex? In other words, in our language, why do they suffer from pride? Well, it's simply because they've cut themselves off from their source. They've denied any relationship whatever to God, so they make themselves little gods. They elevate their conditioned character into that of an absolute. So they go around as carbon paper, calling themselves an original. And they say, see, nobody made me. I'm my own author, I'm my own law, I'm my own will, I'm my own redeemer, I'm my own savior. And you say to them, yes, but you have no signature. Who made you? And then they get mad when you ask them. Or they're like a pendulum. A pendulum in a clock is free to swing so long as it is attached to the clock. But once it becomes detached from the clock, it's no longer free to swing. Now, modern man is like this pendulum that is detached from the clock. He's alienated himself from his God. And he says, oh yes, I can swing. Pick me up in your hand and see. And when we pick him up in our hands, we see how dictators are made. When people lose their sense of responsibility, lower their consciousness of personality, forget the bonds that tied them to their Maker, then they become mere things, and it is not long until a dictator comes along, picks them up, and bends them to his own will. That is how socialism is made. What's the cure for this unhappiness that comes from people being so proud and vain and egotistic? Well, the cure is to be found, actually, in the virtue of humility. You never hear anything about humility anymore. Oh, that's right, you do. I said that so innocent. That's the price I have to pay for spending only 2 minutes a day on a newspaper. But up until then, there wasn't much heard about humility. And people think humility means a submissiveness, a passiveness, a willingness to be walked on, or a desire constantly to live in a doghouse. No, that's not the meaning of humility. Humility is a virtue by which we recognize ourselves as we really are. Not as we would like to be in the eyes of the public, not as our press notices say we are, but as we are when we examine our conscience. Now that isn't too difficult to understand. In any work, there are two things to be considered. First of all, the talent, and secondly, the limitations of the talent. First of all, a man may have a talent as a carpenter. That is to say, he has a capacity to work with wood. But if he's a humble man, he will recognize that he has certain limitations, and he is not a watchmaker. A scientist, for example, has a talent. If he's a humble man, he'll be proud of the talent of being able to read the universe in terms of mathematics. But if he's a humble man, too, he'll recognize his limitations and not tell us his idea of God unless he's a theologian. Take, for example, an angel. If my angel has humility, well, first of all, you recognize that he has a talent for cleaning blackboards. And then you recognize that he has no talent whatever for reading Karl Marx. That's why in the little cartoon that we did in the series last year, we have him with the book of Karl Marx, and Karl Marx is upside down. Now take, for example, ourselves. Here we are out on a stage talking to you on television. Would I be humble if I said, "Oh, I can't talk. I don't know how to give ideas. I have no words, and there are hundreds. There are 100 million other people in the United States who could do this better than I can." No, I have a certain talent for it. The good Lord has blessed me. He's given me an opportunity for education. He's given me the gift of expressing ideas fairly, clearly. And therefore, I must thank him for it. But I'll also recognize my limitations. Now, I will not come out here and dance. I've never danced in my life. And I can promise you one thing, you'll never hear me sing. Neither will I come out here, for example, and try to be a comedian. If there's anything funny, it will be to illustrate a point, but not just to be funny for the sake of being funny, because I have no capacity for that. And therefore, the humble beings will be those who will recognize themselves as they really are and be very humble before God because they know they're so undeserving of his goodness and any gifts that he may have given us. We will recognize, too, that whatever talent we have, we will use it to the best of our abilities. And there are other talents which we do not have, we will not be able to use. And we will not have an inferiority complex about it. One who can sing will not try to be a dancer and so forth. Then in relationship to our neighbor, humility will show up by always looking for what is best in the neighbor and always looking for what is worst in ourselves. Then we will understand the inspiration of all humility, namely the God-man who came to this earth. And the night before he died, knelt down, took a basin and a towel, girded himself, and washed the feet of his own apostles. Not even divinity precluded humility. And his followers will never suffer from what is called an inferiority complex, for in the language of John the Baptist, in the face of him they will say, I must decrease, he must increase. Heaven is very high. The gate to it is very low. Humility is the condition of entering it. Bye now. God love you.